Was glauben Sie, warum wurde diese mächtige Burg aufgegeben? Schreiben Sie Ihre Meinung in die Kommentare, abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal. Vielen herzlichen Dank fürs Zuschauen. Herzlich willkommen, liebe Freunde. Heute entdecken wir gemeinsam die wahre Geschichte einer mächtigen deutschen Burg und erfahren, warum sie für immer verlassen wurde.
High above the Swabian Alp, the ruins of Hohenurach look out silently over the valley. Grass and small trees now grow where soldiers once guarded heavy stone gates. This massive stone footprint belonged to an intimidating, highly active military installation. From this height, a small garrison could monitor every path, road, and military movement in the valley below. If this mountain made the fortress strategic and incredibly difficult to attack, why is it just an empty ruin today? We often assume that massive fortifications like this are destroyed by a single catastrophic battle or a massive siege. The truth is more specific. The steep, isolated mountain that once protected the fortress eventually became its greatest liability. To understand that shift, we have to look at how early warfare worked. In the Middle Ages, extreme elevation was the single greatest defensive advantage an army could possess. If an invading army wanted to reach these walls, they had to drag heavy, cumbersome siege engines up the rocky mountain face. The climb itself forced attackers to exhaust their men and animals on treacherous paths before they ever reached the main gates. During this era, the landscape functioned as an active weapon, making the fortress virtually untouchable. That defensive math worked until heavy artillery entered the battlefield. High, flat stone walls were suddenly vulnerable to heavy projectiles fired from a distance, which could shatter traditional defenses. This blueprint shows the transition required to stay relevant. Hohenurach evolved from a simple aristocratic castle into a sprawling, militarized fortress, a Festung. Engineers thickened walls and added complex earthworks to absorb cannon fire, creating a space to survive prolonged bombardment. But surviving a modern siege was no longer about a quick skirmish. It became a grueling battle against time and resource depletion. This military upgrade created a hidden logistical nightmare. A fortress this size required constant shipments of food, water, and new construction materials to remain operational. Moving a ton of grain along a valley floor is simple. Hauling that same load up a steep mountain path requires exponentially higher costs in manpower and animal labor. To defend the heights, the garrison also needed their own heavy artillery. Dragging thousands of pounds of bronze and iron up these treacherous routes was an exhausting, ruinous expense. Hohenurach was trapped in a geographic paradox. The elevation required to survive a war was bankrupting the treasury during years of peace. Fortresses depend entirely on the political and economic landscape surrounding them. As regional borders shifted and new roads were built, trade and military traffic eventually bypassed the Hohenurach Valley entirely. Once the political necessity vanished, the astronomical cost of maintaining a mountain fortress could no longer be justified. But before the fortress was abandoned, its impenetrable design served one last, darker purpose. The walls built to keep enemies out were repurposed into a prison, where rulers kept political prisoners securely locked away from the world. Today, Hohenurach stands as a silent testament to the cost of isolation. When a structure, or an empire, fails to adapt to shifting maps and logistical realities, it is inevitably reclaimed by nature. Forget the fairy tales of noble knights and grand banquets. Real medieval castles were built for brutal survival. In the deeply fragmented territories of medieval Germany, power constantly shifted through inheritances, alliances, and violent conflict. Castles were pragmatic tools designed to enforce raw territorial control. This map shows the Duchy of Württemberg, a complex and vulnerable territorial puzzle. Hohenurach served as a vital defensive node within this larger system, locking down key geographical routes and protecting state assets. In such an unstable political landscape, a stronghold's purpose was clear. It existed to project authority, house soldiers, and physically secure an elite ruler's wealth from rival factions. But military technology eventually forced the rulers of Europe into a corner. The widespread adoption of gunpowder artillery and heavy cannons meant attackers could strike with devastating kinetic force. For centuries, castles relied on height for defense. But high, relatively thin stone masonry could not withstand concentrated cannon fire. A few direct hits would breach the walls, turning a secure keep into a fatal trap. Rulers faced a brutal ultimatum: engage in a wildly expensive architectural arms race, or face total annihilation by rival armies equipped with modern siege weapons. Hohenurach could no longer afford to remain a standard local stronghold. To survive the era of artillery, the entire structure had to undergo a radical physical mutation. Military engineers arrived with a new philosophy. They began converting Hohenurach from a traditional medieval burg, a castle, into a modernized Festung, or fortress. Engineers thickened outer defenses with massive masonry to absorb heavy impacts. Walls were redesigned to eliminate blind spots beneath the ramparts. Builders integrated firing platforms, allowing the garrison to mount cannons and create an offensive weapon system. For the people living in the valley below, watching this massive compound take shape on the mountain must have been awe-inspiring. Hohenurach was now a highly visible, imposing symbol of absolute state dominance. Yet all that structural muscle created a severe paradox. During peacetime, massive fortresses function as economic black holes. Every single day required a relentless expenditure of resources. Stonework needed constant repair, heavy timber roofs required replacement, weapons required maintenance, and a standing garrison of soldiers demanded continuous food, shelter, and pay. To justify this continuous financial drain, rulers assigned the isolated, heavily secured compound a dark second job. Hohenurach became a state prison. Escaping an elevated fortress was nearly impossible. A political prisoner locked behind these walls could look out and see the free villages in the valley, visible in the distance, yet entirely out of reach. The heavy iron grates and massive reinforced walls designed to repel invading armies performed a dual purpose. They created the ultimate, inescapable trap for anyone locked on the inside. Meanwhile, outside the confines of the valley, Europe was fracturing. Decades of religious tension and shifting alliances among a competing elite were pushing the continent toward a breaking point. The pressure finally broke in 1618 with the eruption of the 30 Years' War, a regional dispute that rapidly escalated into a devastating continental power struggle. Marauding armies swept through the German territories. They left behind burning cities, plundered villages, widespread famine, and rampant disease. The Duchy of Württemberg was violently pulled into the chaos. Its borders were breached, placing Hohenurach directly in the path of marching enemy columns. In an instant, the compound shed its peacetime identity. The prison cells and the unknowing economic burdens were overshadowed by an immediate, existential threat. Decades of exhausting financial drain and radical architectural mutation led to this exact moment. Now, the massive stone walls of Hohenurach would finally face their ultimate test of survival against the apocalypse of 17th century warfare. We tend to view historical fortresses from the outside, focusing on the scale of the towers and gates. However, the historical life of Hohenurach unfolded behind these barriers, hidden from the world below. When the site was militarized, it functioned as a self-contained world. It was a closed system forced to sustain itself without immediate help from the valleys. Keeping that system running required a relentless daily grind. Sentries worked strict watch rotations, weapons required constant maintenance to prevent rust, and commanders had to track every pound of grain and barrel of water in their inventories. This rigid routine was fueled by a constant paranoia. A heavy wooden door left unbarred, or a minor disruption in the supply chain, was a fatal vulnerability that could compromise the entire garrison. While the exterior projected unbreakable strength, the interior reality was delicate. The fortress was a highly regulated ecosystem that always hovered on the edge of logistical failure. The mountain's height forced attackers into a grueling uphill battle under the defenders' observation. But this elevation created a severe logistical burden. Unable to grow crops on the rocky summit, every item needed for survival had to be hauled up the steep incline. During peacetime, dragging carts up the mountain was merely exhausting. Once a hostile force arrived in the valley, that journey became impossible. The geography keeping soldiers safe from artillery also severed their connection to the outside world. Their greatest defensive asset was also their most dangerous isolation. These walls look outward to block an approaching army, but they also look inward. They are as effective at trapping people as they are at keeping them out. Hohenurach regularly functioned as a political prison. The historical reality of the conditions is harsh enough that the site requires no exaggerated legends or ghost stories to convey a sense of dread. Authorities used the mountain to strip inmates of all external influence. Once locked inside, a prisoner was severed from the society they left behind. Isolation defined the fortress. In a time of war, that trait would turn on the very soldiers tasked with defending the walls. Siege warfare was rarely about storming the gates. An attacking force simply encircled the perimeter, sealed the exits, and waited. The moment those closed, the countdown began. The garrison relied on an internal water reservoir. Without clean water, stone defenses became useless. As the days turned into weeks, the line between defender and prisoner began to vanish. With the gates locked and rations restricted, the soldiers experienced the same confinement as the inmates. Attackers relied on invisible enemies to bypass the stone. The first wave brought hunger, followed by deep physical exhaustion. Sickness spread through cramped quarters. As the death toll rose, a paralyzing fear set in. During a prolonged standoff, the true threat wasn't the infantry outside. It was the walls themselves, trapping the garrison inside with decaying supplies. This map of the Duchy of Württemberg captures the geopolitical layout of southwest Germany during the 17th century, a region consumed by the 30 Years' War. In 1634, a defeat at Nordlingen sent armies spilling across these borders, putting crushing pressure on local populations. In the valleys, the environment deteriorated into terror. Mercenary troops seized civilian grain stores, diseases ravaged towns, and refugees fled their homes searching for any shelter. This crisis activated Hohenurach for its ultimate purpose. The garrison sealed the gates to see if their stockpiles could outlast a total societal collapse. The fortification held off the military threat, but only by abandoning the world below to preserve the tiny population on the summit. Despite this success, the complex could not resist the larger evolution of European warfare. Every static defensive line carries an expiration date. Eventually, any walled compound will succumb to starvation, betrayal, a negotiated surrender, or technology that renders stone walls irrelevant. Hohenurach remains a monument to a brutal era, a time when the only way to survive was locking yourself inside a stone cage. This 1558 map shows the Duchy of Württemberg as a dense network of towns and villages. After 1634, these settlements became vulnerable targets as imperial troops pushed into the heart of the territory, threatening the state's very existence. Hohenurach stood as the primary defense against this incursion. Its architects built the fortress high on a mountain peak, specifically designed to use the steep, forested terrain to trap and exhaust any approaching army. Laying siege to a mountain peak forced an attacker into a financial nightmare. They had to supply thousands of soldiers in a fixed position, maneuver heavy artillery up vertical slopes, and hope their men didn't succumb to camp diseases before the walls gave way. The fortress fulfilled its engineering purpose by remaining a functional stronghold throughout the conflict, demonstrating that its geography and defenses made it a barrier that few armies were willing to challenge. Intrigued, despite this defensive success, Hohenurach's story didn't end in a final climactic battle. No invading army ever leveled these walls with heavy cannons. In a strange historical turn, the Duchy of Württemberg issued an official order for its own people to dismantle the entire complex, piece by piece. This raises the central question of why a state would spend generations building a battle-proven masterpiece, only to spend even more effort intentionally destroying it. By 1648, the economic reality in Württemberg was catastrophic. The war had destroyed villages and left agricultural fields abandoned, leaving the state with virtually no tax revenue to fund its recovery. This poverty highlighted a hidden cost of military architecture. Fortresses require a massive, continuous supply of capital just to stay standing during peacetime. Nature causes constant physical decay. Water seeps into masonry, structural timbers rot, and roofs cave in, requiring a never-ending cycle of expensive repairs. Beyond the masonry, the government had to pay for a permanent garrison of soldiers and the upkeep of the artillery pieces stationed on the heights. For a bankrupt state, the fortress had transitioned from a protective asset into a liability that constantly drained the treasury. As Württemberg struggled with maintenance costs, the external threat changed. By the late 17th century, artillery had become more powerful, mobile, and accurate than ever before. Survival now required a different kind of architecture, the bastion system. This design used low, incredibly thick walls in sprawling star shapes, specifically angled to deflect direct cannon fire. Fitting this geometric requirement onto Hohenurach hits a physical wall. The fortress sits on a narrow peak surrounded by cliffs. A mountain cannot be expanded laterally, making the sprawling star fort footprint physically impossible. The new defenses would simply hang over empty air. The very mountain that once made the fortress invincible had become a trap, making it impossible to modernize the site against current technology. By the 18th century, the leaders of Württemberg viewed Hohenurach through a cold strategic lens. The modernization costs were too high, its future strategic value was low, and the daily maintenance was still consuming critical state funds. They made the practical decision to cut their losses. The state systematically destroyed the fortress, stripping the walls to ensure the site could no longer act as a financial drain. Identifying when a historical asset has become a strategic burden is a vital part of a nation's long-term survival. The demolition of Hohenurach was a calculated act of statecraft, prioritizing the future over an obsolete past.
These walls have stood for centuries, stripped of their roofs and hollowed out until they became part of the landscape. When we see stone shattered like this, we tend to assume a history of violence, conquering armies, heavy siege engines, and a desperate final stand. If not war, we look to the quiet, slow erosion of time. We expect that decades of wind and rain eventually ground the architecture down until it could no longer hold its own weight. But Hohenurach survived its wars. Perched on a high, isolated peak, its geography made it nearly impossible to attack. No enemy ever managed to bring these walls down in combat. The reality was a calculated demolition. In the 18th century, the state packed the structure with explosives and intentionally blew up its own defenses. the state spent massive resources to dismantle a fortification that no enemy could ever take. Why spend time and money to destroy your own invincible stronghold? To understand that choice, we have to look past the stone and see the castle as a tool. Like any tool, it was built for a specific utilitarian purpose. For generations, Hohenurach worked perfectly. It projected authority over the valley, controlled vital strategic corridors, and served as a high-security prison for the state's most important captives. Its strength came from this isolated peak. Attackers down in the valley faced a grueling uphill climb before they could even begin a siege. However, that same geography created a permanent logistical headache for the owners. Every plank of wood, every stone for repairs, and every meal for the permanent garrison had to be dragged up the steep mountain path. The strategic return on investment had to be high enough to justify those crushing daily expenses. Eventually, the strategic landscape shifted. Warfare began to favor highly mobile armies and advanced siege artillery that could bypass old mountain strongholds. A static fort on a mountaintop could no longer dictate the defense of a modern territory. While Hohenurach's military value disappeared, the cost of keeping it supplied and repaired remained constant. The state couldn't simply lock the doors and walk away. An abandoned castle is an empty fort liability. If left ungarrisoned, an invading enemy could march in, set up camp, and use those same impenetrable walls against its own creators. To eliminate that risk, the state ordered the buildings stripped and the walls detonated, rendering the site militarily useless. The thick walls that had protected the state for generations had become too dangerous to leave standing. Once the engineers finished their work, nature was left to manage the site. Without a garrison to clear the growth or fix the masonry, frost and roots slowly broke down the remaining stone. We often view ruins as symbols of failure, assuming that a collapsed roof means the builders were defeated. But military architecture is tied to its era. Its lifespan is dictated by the technology and strategy of the day, not the thickness of the stone. Hohenurach fulfilled its intended purpose for centuries. It held its territory through heavy conflict before being essentially honorably discharged. These ruins mark the point where the strategic world outgrew its tools, leaving the fortress to begin its second life as a relic. Today, you won't hear any shouted commands ringing out over the walls of Hohenurach. There are no guards inspecting travelers at the gate, and no munitions being stockpiled for a siege. Instead, hikers casually walk up the mountain on a weekend afternoon to enjoy the view. But for centuries, stepping foot on this peak without permission would have been a fatal mistake. This site was a highly restricted, heavily armed machine of war, designed to dominate the valley below and crush anyone who challenged it. Erecting a monumental fortress at this elevation served a specific psychological purpose. Massive stone walls suspended in the clouds project absolute territorial might. They communicate to allies and enemies alike that the ruling power is an immovable fact of nature, designed to last forever. How does a structure of this scale, funded by an entire territory and engineered to be indestructible, actually come to an end? There was no final crushing siege that broke this peak. These empty stone shells are the physical result of the owners simply deciding that the fortress was no longer worth the price of its own existence. To understand why a military power would abandon its own stronghold, we have to look at these stones differently. They are the physical remnants of ancient cost-benefit analyses. When leaders originally chose to build on this specific peak, the strategic calculation was obvious. The altitude provided natural protection, the steep incline offered built-in defense, and the sweeping view across the landscape guaranteed absolute control over anyone moving through the region. But those geographical advantages came with a crushing logistical penalty. To claim that control, every single limestone block used in construction, every heavy iron tool,
and every drop of drinking water had to be hauled up that exact same steep incline by sheer muscle. And once the walls were finished, the bleeding of resources didn't stop. Winter storms and erosion required constant structural repairs. The isolated garrison needed a continuous pipeline of food and firewood just to survive the harsh conditions on the peak. Keeping the site operational meant feeding, housing, and paying hundreds of armed men, rotating them through the mountain fortress year after grueling year. A powerful fortress was never a one-time expense. It was a massive, ongoing financial liability. The walls only stood strong as long as the people in charge possessed the immense willpower and the deep pockets required to fund them. By the early modern era, the geopolitical map began to fracture. As new territorial empires clashed over religion and politics, the demands placed on mountain strongholds suddenly shifted. The introduction of gunpowder and heavy artillery turned traditional high-walled castles into death traps. A well-placed cannonball could shatter a vertical medieval wall with terrifying ease. Rulers adapted, pouring resources into retrofitting Hohenurach. Thick, sloped earthen embankments were layered over old stone to absorb cannon fire. Yet despite these expensive upgrades, war strategies changed rapidly. Sprawling conflicts like the 30 Years' War prioritized mobile field armies over static mountain sieges. Eventually, a new generation of military decision-makers took power. They looked at the towering walls of Hohenurach, reviewed the ledgers, and ran a completely new cost-benefit analysis. By the 18th century, the math had turned against the mountain. Maintaining a single high-altitude garrison cost as much as mobilizing several mobile battalions in the valley below. The strategic value of the peak had been overtaken by cheaper, more flexible military options. Hohenurach was a relic of a specialized form of combat that the world had outgrown. Its walls remained, but the logic that required them had evaporated. Once the funding withdrew and the final soldiers marched away, the fortress began a slow, quiet process of dissolving back into the natural landscape. Ceilings caved in, turning claustrophobic defensive firing positions into open, scenic overlooks. Heavily restricted military checkpoints slowly deteriorated into public walking trails. A pristine, fully restored castle can easily feel like a distant museum piece. But walking through these decaying open walls makes the sheer weight of passing centuries a physical, spatial experience. The ruin proves a difficult truth for any ruling power. No piece of military technology remains perpetually modern, and no strategic advantage is immune to the erosion of time. Put yourself in the shoes of those final commanders tasked with evaluating the mountain fortress. If you were running the numbers, would you have made the cold, logical choice to abandon your ancestors' multi-generational legacy? Or would you have stubbornly fought to maintain it, no matter the cost? Let us know what you would decide down in the comments. And if you want to uncover more true stories hidden inside the forgotten walls of the past, make sure to subscribe to the channel.